Societal elites are the apex class which commandeers a dominion over the rest of the social pyramid. The existence of an elite class permeated throughout history and is a fundamental organizational structure of any civilization. Their dominance stems from the inherent power in which they possess, the affluence which they enjoy, the influence which they hold, or more often than not, a confluence of all three. Many an attempt have been made to define exactly what an elite is. Pareto divides society into two strata, of which the higher one is either a governing or non-ruling elite. Moscow presents a more dichotomous definition of the ruler and the ruled. Others have further classified it under Weberian and Marxist frameworks of power and resource ownership for the former and class dominance for the latter. The commonality lies in the ability and propensity of this group to control the rest of society through wealth, power, and influence. When we examine the years ensuing post-Joseon Korea, we find that the elites there exhibit the same defining characteristics and are merely different in name and form. These tumultuous years of 20th century that followed and the upheavals in the world and regional order presented a great catalyst for structural change in these elites, leading to an emergence of the bourgeoisie capitalists from the aristocrats of the old. The intricacy of this evolutionary change presents a fascinating opportunity for exploration. So join us as we delve into the annals of history. The rise of a hereditary aristocracy in Korea first began in Goryeo, the first dynasty ruling over a unified Korean peninsula. As King Seonjong reorganized his government into a closely replicated model of the Tang dynasty system. This reform led to an immediate decline of the militarist factions, which dominated during Goryeo's founding, though they would later re-emerge in equal prominence after the 1170 coup d'etat. The rise of the civilian-centered institutions of power was the antecedent for what would become the Yangban class through the Joseon dynasty. National civil service exams known as Wagyo, inspired by Tang China, also became a defining instrument of semi-meritocratic ascension into the civil aristocratic bureaucracy. In the last decades of Goryeo, the aristocrats began identifying as Yangban and became associated with a social status, and not merely a hereditary tradition of holding office in the imperial government. These practices became entrenched in the successor Joseon dynasty, with graduates of the government service and military examinations both vying for domination of the government bureaucracy as they entered their respective civil and military branches. The Confucian state ideology espoused in Goryeo had been instrumental in preserving the dominance of the Yangban, which later evolved into Neo-Confucianism during the Joseon era. Neo-Confucian thought continued to promulgate the inheritance of social status, completely usurping the initially semi-meritocratic examination system to become endogamic in nature. The words of a minister of the Office of Census clearly identified this line of thinking, that the examinations had become a traditional way of considering family line and birth, not to judge him off only by his capability. Several rules were established with regards to the dynastic succession of a person's Yangban status, the first of which was generational excellence, meaning that while inheritance was a prerequisite qualification to be of Yangban status, the maintenance of this status was accomplished by a non-codified requirement of historical service by one's immediate ancestors in the government. Loss of eminence and privilege ensued upon the failure to hold office in the government, providing excellent incentive for continued servitude to the Joseon state. Secondly, the practice of endogamy was strictly enforced, with severe punishment for men who chose to marry out of his caste. Those who had married widows or commoner women were stripped of their Yangban status and banned from civil service. This policy contributed an inherent sense of superiority by Yangban, who possessed a pure-blood pedigree. Lastly, the need to consistently demonstrate one's Yangbanness resulted in prohibition of menial work of all sorts, including farming, manufacturing, and commerce. This came about as self-styled Yangban began to rise rapidly in numbers alongside increasing bureaucracy, resulting in diminishing of the value of the Yangban status, and the need to stave off such depreciation by demonstrating authentic Yangban pedigree. Such extremism was showcased when Yangban, who faced impending financial ruin due to various circumstances, refused to engage in menial occupations or seek government assistance, even if it meant starvation and certain death. This was accompanied by social disapproval and discrimination against former Yangban, who have been effectively demoted to a commoner via participation in such labor. The contention of the Yangban towards manufacturing and commerce particularly would be subject to several disadvantages towards the end of the Joseon dynasty and give rise to the rapid extinction and replacement by bourgeois capitalists, as we shall soon see. The last years of the Joseon dynasty was marked by an isolationist foreign policy, which coincided with the Meiji Restoration in neighboring Japan and its subsequent industrialization. Japan's modernization led to the adoption of Western military technology. This increased might, enabling it to effect gunboat diplomacy until Joseon Korea in the 1876 Treaty of Kanwa, which forcibly opened Korea to trade. Despite the perilous outlook on national sovereignty, the long-established Yangban aristocracy was none the wiser. It had retained its stranglehold on Korean state and society due to centuries of land ownership. The selective control of the civil service examinations and strategic endogamy, thus maintaining a tight grip on power and enjoying its privileges, business as usual. At this juncture, Joseon Korea was essentially an agrarian economy. As the ports opened, enterprising capitalists made fortunes in rice and other agricultural exports, particularly Yangban landlords, whose rental incomes from the agricultural land and export sales itself was particularly enriching to their treasuries up until the Japanese annexation in 1910. Interestingly, the neo-Confucian attitudes had persisted to the very end for the older generations of Yangban, who felt that commercial activities were a violation of their moralistic principles and refused to entertain the formal incorporation of a company or acknowledge themselves as a businessman. Despite so, they were not averse to participating in rice exports and deepening their pockets in the process. As Japanese imperialism intensified near the turn of the century, it became a significant concern for Koreans, who reacted with rising nationalism by forming armed guerrilla groups. For the Yangban, the matters more subtle, including the promotion of a patriotic enlightenment movement destined to strengthen the nation by educating about and advocating for the adoption of Western technology, institutions, and ideals. Particular emphasis was placed on commercial development and industrialization, which was supported by certain Yangban in its full schools devoted to such Western thought, a progressivism that would have been unheard of just decades before. It was in this climate of nationalism and progressivism where the new generation of Yangban grew up in. Many would ironically turn towards Meiji Japan, their greatest regional threat, as a model to emulate for national development. In this pursuit, Yangban's support for the Japanese installed by reformist government in 1894 was not beyond reason. The Gabo reforms promulgated by that very government marked a complete revolution of elite status, albeit only on an official level. Immediately, the Yangban system was abolished in the first set of reforms, ending nearly a millennium of state-sanctioned aristocracy. Any actual loss in influence and wealth by the Yangban, however, is unlikely, but this had the effect of sanctioning a pivot towards commercial industrial pursuits. Many ex-Yangban did precisely so, setting up small textile factories in one of Korea's first steps towards its greater industrialization goal.
The turn of the century brought significant changes, not least of which was the end of the Joseon dynasty. In the failed bid to exert independence via the symbolic renunciation of his tributary status, King Gojong declared himself emperor of the new Korean Empire in 1897, succeeding the Joseon dynasty. In reality, political governance remained as ineffectual as before, and Japanese encroachment continued. Japan would soon force upon Korea various one-sided treaties in 1905 and 1907, only to completely annex the peninsula in 1910. Under the new colonial masters, Korea quickly became a police state under the Bhutan Seiji military rule of its first two governors-general. The peninsula, now subject to the whims of Japanese interests, was fashioned as a cheap rice granary for the Japanese and an export market for the Japanese manufacturers, while stifling Korean entrepreneurship via repressive corporate laws. Under these circumstances, the elites found themselves straddling between the identities of an emerging bourgeois capitalist and a nationalist. It was accepted as a matter of fact that Japan was a successful modernizer in whose footsteps Korea had to follow. Thus, Japan became a natural choice of higher education for the new generation of elites, providing these young men their first encounters with New Age capitalism and Western technology. Unsurprisingly, these men became obsessed with the Japanese modernity and strength, laying the grounds for their future participation in colonial corporatism. Their extensive linguistic and cultural training allowing for swift navigation through the highest circles of colonial business and politics. However, the political subjugation was not appreciated by all. Some of the Yangban descent, like the Goshang Kims, would tolerate the Japanese until the latter became overbearingly unreasonable. Others stood with the pro-Japanese Ilchin Ho in openly supporting the annexation, in complete disregard of their patriotic stance. By 1919, resistance and discontentment had grown significantly. The earlier colonial period has seen severe agricultural depression, during which self-serving landlords happily transferred the burdens onto the tenants and purchased discounted land parcels, yielding substantial wealth accumulation. The common folk, however, were worse for the wear, culminating in the popular demonstrations of the March 1st movements. While heavily suppressed, it was embarrassing enough for the colonial government to adopt a new bunka seiji policy, where stiff militaristic style policing took a backseat to dangling the carrot, and restrictive corporate laws were repealed to encourage industrialization. This was again an immediate boon for the new age Korean bourgeois capitalists who, having taken the reins from their business-averse forefathers and seeking diversification from agriculture, began investing profits into an emerging industrial sector, particularly in textiles. Colonial-era ideology reinforced the primitive backwardness of the old Joseon dynasty while raising modern Japan as a symbol of modernity. To align oneself with the enlightened colonial policies was key to securing benefits, as the new bourgeois class would discover. By 1919, the rice depression of the previous years made it clear of the need to improve rice production to ensure a steady supply of cheap rice for the Japanese population. Landlords thus received substantial subsidies and low-interest financing to conduct land and irrigation improvement, purchase modern farm machinery, adopt chemical fertilizers, and improve quality control, thereby increasing the value of their entire operation. While it was envisioned to maintain Korea as an agrarian colony, this line of thought was soon outdated, as the post-World War I demand boom followed the massive European withdrawal from the Asian markets. Even the modern facilities in Japan could not keep up with this demand. Thus, the obvious solution was to promote Korea's industrialization. For the elites with spare capital, investment into the textile industry to accompany the already established agriculture for raw cotton was a no-brainer. The new conciliatory policies were certainly not born of out of benevolence. For the Japanese, the bourgeoisie presented a dangerous element of resistance due to their class prestige and financial resources. This was especially so during the earlier Budan Seiji era, whose heavy-handed policies had disenfranchised many bourgeois elements who had previously cooperated with the Japanese. The effect was twofold. Firstly, modification via a reasonable degree of benevolence in colonial policy discouraged further complaints from the moderates. Secondly, placating the bourgeois capitalists and co-opting them in the industrialization process at the expense of the hoi polloi became instrumental in continued class divide, so as to exterminate the fledgling nationalism movement through disunity. Of course, with lucrative incentives dangling before their eyes, the bourgeois capitalists played right into the Japanese hands, a myopic but unsurprising move. In an unprecedented first, Korean businessmen were invited as participants of the Industrial Commission of 1921, setting the tone for Japanese-Korean cooperation and the plans for national development. Subsequently, Japanese-Korean joint companies became a major feature of the colonial economy, where Korean bourgeoisie could busy themselves with profit-making, while the Japanese masters were content in maintaining oversight. Even during the wartime consolidation of enterprises in the late 1930s, care was taken to preserve independent Korean firms to retain their owners as allies. Colonial Korea became undisputedly a training ground for the nascent Korean bourgeoisie class. It is therefore unsurprising that many household names in modern Korea trace their beginnings to corporate capitalism of the colonial era, including one of the Chaebols, huge run family conglomerates to emerge out of the colonial era, the Yangban Group. Post-war, the liberation of the Korean peninsula from the Japanese was followed immediately with its present-day division along the 38th parallel. The future of the newly established bourgeoisie was thus cast into doubt. Tainted by self-serving collaborationism with the Japanese occupiers, they were expected to face the wrath of their long downtrodden people. Yet once again, the politics of the day saved the elites from certain extinction, as the US stepped in to secure South Korea as a bulwark against communism. Those remaining in the communist north were not as lucky. Furthermore, the bourgeoisie has left behind most of the industrial base in the north as they fled south, and resultingly the country was in a sorry state. Subsequently, almost 15 years of chaos ensued, including a bungling US military occupation, massacres of political enemies, the entire tragic affair of the Korean War, and the final years of corrupt rule by Syngman Rhee as he attempted to cling on to presidential power whilst the country was barely subsisting on foreign aid. The first signs of improvement will only show after Park Chung-hee ascended the presidency in a military coup d'etat against the Second Republic. A strongman military dictator by nature, Park's reign was unequivocally authoritarian, as the deposed Rhee before him, and yet he performed the miracle of growing the country into an industrial powerhouse in one generation. Throughout this, a close-knit cooperation with the bourgeoisie capitalists played an instrumental role in this transformation. Earlier in 1949, the land reform policy eliminated the last vestiges of the Yangban by redistributing property above a certain size to farmers, while the landlords were compensated monetarily. This had the effect of virtually eliminating tenancy, which accelerated the push for landlords to redirect their capital towards industry and commerce, facilitating the transition of the landlord class into bourgeois capitalists. Park, with his background in the Manchukuo army, was inspired by the Meiji-style state-planned economics and developed strong nationalist mottos to accompany his reforms, much akin to Kim Il-sung in the north. It was only later, after committing several economic blunders, that he realized the ineptness of military elites like himself in dealing with the economy, and he required the expertise of bourgeois capitalists, most of whom who were just re-establishing themselves after the tumultuous post-war years. Larger Chaebols like Samsung, who had established themselves prior to the end of World War II, remained unaffected by the Korean War and was in healthy growth. Thus, in the immediacy of the coup d'etat, Their leaders, such as Lee Byung-chul, were detained for corrupt relations with past governments and threatened with execution. They were released immediately after signing agreements to aid Park in his national reconstruction effort. Thus, after being arm-twisted by Park into cooperation, the Chaebol leaders were appointed to an economic reconstruction committee, cementing the characteristic state-Chaebol relationship that followed throughout his rule. This symbiotic relationship was one where Park allowed Chaebols to implement economic development with significant autonomy and discretion, while adhering to his overall vision. Both were indispensable to each other's goals. This relation was built upon Park's ability to conduct the challenging act of balancing between the state and Chaebol, defending the Chaebol allies from financial doom in return for their high-risk investments into his technologically demanding industrial projects, while implementing intense competition between the top conglomerates and second and third-tier challengers struggling to enter the Chaebol club. For the latter, many emerging bourgeois capitalists will grow their enterprises into Chaebols of their own right. Though in usual cutthroat fashion, the weakest of the Chaebols will be readily sacrificed to save the stronger majority. This built a system where only the strongest Chaebols, who could compete efficiently and meet government targets, survive. There was no latitude for complacencies. Naturally, Park continued his stranglehold on political power, and when Chaebols were deemed to step out of line, they were punished with swift destruction as fair warning to the rest. The Chaebols, socially unpopular for the corruption and illicit wealth accumulation in the past years, were therefore at the political mercy of Park, who had popular support in building the disciplinary apparatus. Despite the looming threats, it was an excellent time for competent but obedient bourgeois capitalists to grow their conglomerates. Multitudes of favorable policies were enacted, including the investment of credit into the Chaebols by state-owned banks, exemption from import duties, and special rates for utilities and railway usage. This extraordinary market privileges kept the bourgeoisie happy to continue accumulating wealth under state protection, but came at the expense of the usual political hegemony that bourgeois capitalists tended to enjoy in other capitalist economies. At the same time, the state too became dependent on the economic hegemony of Chaebol groups and could not ignore their demands and needs, especially when they faced certain demise. Their place in the South Korea's export-oriented economy also made sentiment towards Korea's economic stability by foreign investors a key point to consider. A key Chaebol's financial failure, for example, also reflected political failure on the part of Park's developmental state model. This was clearly demonstrated when Park ordered executive action to replace high-interest loans with highly favorable long-term loans to come to the rescue of failing Chaebols. This mutual level of co-vulnerability was an essential part of the state-Chaebol relationship. The state could not withdraw subsidies, else it risked damaging its credibility and the prospect of future investment. Likewise, the Chaebol could not exit from their business because of financial losses. In the words of Kim and Vogel, they were each other's guarantors. The culture of state-Chaebol collaboration, instituted by Park, will continue years after the dictator had fallen, where the modern liberal democratic constitution had emerged. The modern Chaebol, a conglomerate of family-run firms with opaque corporate structure, centralized planning, cross-shareholding, and insider trading, were the result of these formative years of collaboration during the Park's Third Republic and their own ingenious methods of self-preservation. Looking back at the miracle on the Han River, we note the indubitable contribution of the Chaebols towards modern-day South Korean economic success. The historical Yangban aristocratic class, who had dominated Korean society for a millennium, underwent significant evolution in the epochal era of change in the world order. In this crucible of colonial rule and post-war recovery, the bourgeois capitalists emerged. These men, born of entrepreneurial prowess and inspired by Japanese example of national strengthening, turned humble firms into Chaebol conglomerates, becoming a cornerstone of the South Korean economy. Throughout this evolution, we observe that several things remain in constant possession of the elite class: wealth, influence, and power, all required to steer the ship of their civilizations on behalf of the common man.